Past perfect tense. I had verb in past participle form and rest of the sentence. I had visited India last year. I hadn't visited India last year. Had I visited India last year? Hadn't I visited India last year? I had visited India last year. Hadn't I? I hadn't visited India last year. Had I? You had verb in past participle form and rest of the sentence. You had visited India last year. You hadn't visited India last year. Had you visited India last year? Hadn't you visited India last year? You had visited India last year, hadn't you? You hadn't visited India last year, had you? We had verb in past participle form and rest of the sentence. We had visited India last year. We hadn't visited India last year. Had we visited India last year? Hadn't we visited India last year? We had visited India last year, hadn't we? We hadn't visited India last year, had we? They had verb in past participle form and rest of the sentence. They had visited India last year. They hadn't visited India last year. Had they visited India last year? Hadn't they visited India last year? They had visited India last year, hadn't they? They hadn't visited India last year, had they? He had verb in past participle form and rest of the sentence. He had visited India last year. He hadn't visited India last year. Had he visited India last year? Hadn't he visited India last year? He had visited India last year, hadn't he? He hadn't visited India last year, had he? She had verb in past participle form and rest of the sentence. She had visited India last year. She hadn't visited India last year. Had she visited India last year? Hadn't she visited India last year? She had visited India last year, hadn't she? She hadn't visited India last year, had she? It had verb in past participle form and rest of the sentence. It had visited India last year. It hadn't visited India last year. Had it visited India last year? Hadn't it visited India last year? It had visited India last year, hadn't it? It hadn't visited India last year, had it?